My name is David Fleckner. I'm in the INSEAD Global Executive MBA program. It's a pleasure to see all of you today. We now enter our final block, and this is called Global Agreements and Frameworks. And we're going to turn our attention to cross-sector topics right now. We discussed how to overcome challenges and scale low-carbon solutions in Brazil in several sectors today. To complement these sectoral actions, we need to set coherent and comprehensive policy frameworks and adequate financing mechanisms to allow all of this to happen. And there's been some great debate over the course of today. We hope you're taking away and thinking about carefully as you think about opportunities to get further involved. From clean energy to infrastructure, financial and public sectors are critical enablers for the global low-carbon transition. Here again, collaboration is key. Global and local financial markets, governments, philanthropies, and businesses all need to move in a coordinated way. Our next session will discuss how finance and policy frameworks have been changing and need to accelerate that urgently in order to support the transition to a net zero world. Now for our panel, without any further ado, please welcome Patricia Ellen, who's the co-founder of Aya Earth and managing partner at Systemiq LATAM. Please, Patricia, welcome once again. And to drive the fireside chat with her, we call back to the stage Jorge Hargrave, who's the director of Maraé Investimentos. Welcome, Jorge.
Thank you, and thank you for. Thank you, and thank you everyone for staying. It's been a long day, a lot of content. Everyone's brain is probably like hot, but we're gonna have a cocktail in a few minutes. But before that, I think we have to look at this transversal view of how policies are supporting already, and which other policies we need to support Brazil's transition to a net zero world, and also like for Brazil to support the global transition to a net zero world. So Patricia, you've been working extensively together with the Minister of Finance on the design of several policies. Can you please update us a little bit on what are the policies that are in place that are already good for the transition, that support the transition? And so do you have a more positive policy framework today than we had a year ago?
Well, thank you, Jorge, and apologies for talking again. You have to, I don't know, Jorge gave me this challenge to integrate a little bit of what we were saying. I don't know if I will integrate or confuse you, especially because now I'm jet lagged. I've just arrived from Brazil this morning. And what we are discussing here is very complex. I think, first of all, we need to acknowledge that. To your question, yes, of course, Brazil is much better now than 1 year ago in terms of policies. Also in the level of integration, not only the public sector, but the private sector and civil society. The fact that we are discussing these things again is already an amazing advancement. But putting all these things together is very complex. So we have an important framework that was launched, which is the Ecological Transformation Plan. And it's very innovative that our Ministry of Finance is leading this transformation, even if you compare to other countries in the world. So a big innovation. It's a cross-ministry plan that has a target to implement a few critical policies, more than 200 actions around 6 main sectors. And we reorganized the way we are translating that in the independent task force in the private sector and academia that Minister Isabella Teixeira and many others here are part of. We organize it around 7 sectors. I also would like to remember that after the launch of the Ecological Transformation Plan, we also had an important change in the Ministry of Industry and Commerce. A few years ago, the Ministry of Industry and Commerce actually didn't exist anymore in Brazil. It made the dialogue with the private sector a challenge. So this government recreated this ministry. Vice President Alckmin leads this ministry. And they launched the new industrial policy, which is very critical for the country, how we reindustrialize Brazil and add value to all the value chains that we described here. Together with that, the same ministry launched the National Decarbonization Strategy, and the Ministry of Environment launched the Climate Plan, They also went back to the NDC goals. There will be a new NDC being announced soon, but there is today a much closer integration across core ministries with the independent task force through the work that we are doing with the IA Institute, and Systemiq is one of the content partners. We have today strategic work with 7 core ministries. And aside from all of this, the last one that I would mention that's very critical here, Jorge, is everything ends in the land use, as you saw here. So we have the Food and Land Use Coalition that, again, Minister Isabella Teixeira is one of the chairs. And we also had a launch in COP28 of the Global Alliance for Food Systems Transformation. This is also critical. Nothing that we said here is going to become a reality if we don't translate this into the land use. And Thiago knows that too, even for Regreen and any company that works in Brazil in carbon credits, it's critical that we speak the same language in everything that's related to land use. So this is the nutshell of all the policies, huge advancements. Of course, we have a few laws that are about to be voted in Congress. The critical one is the carbon markets regulation. We also have the Future Fuels program that's being discussed today in Congress. And finally, a program called Mover that talks about sustainable mobility in the country. So I mentioned the critical ones, but of course, huge advancement that all these laws and programs are being discussed currently in Brazil.
Thanks, Patricia. You mentioned land use, and I want to pick up on something that was mentioned a few sessions before. So Vaki, for example, and André, they mentioned the forest code and the conservation that is done inside the farms in Brazil. Probably part of the audience doesn't know much about the forest code. Can you explain a little bit? This is also an important piece of legislation. It's not new. We have Isabella here as one of the mothers of the latest revision of the forest code. So can you explain a little bit of how it works and how this contributes to sustainability of land use in Brazil?
So Isabella corrected here. She's a lover of the forest code. It's important to make the correction here. But on the forest code, I think as a business investor in Brazil, it's very important to understand that we have a law that needs to be followed. It's critical and varies across regions in Brazil. In the Amazon, you have a limit of legal deforestation that goes up to 20%, whereas in other regions, like in the Cerrado, the limit goes up to 80%. It varies in different regions, but it's a very important law that needs to be followed. And now the major difference that we have in this government that it's been taken super seriously. Command and control is always a challenge in such a big region. And again, the language that we speak and how we compare land use is also a challenge. So traceability was discussed here, and also all the land use permits model that we have are two of the major opportunities and challenges that we are facing and implementing today in Brazil.
And Patricia, you mentioned like where we are now, right? But as part of this process, you heard like more than 200 organizations, more than 800 stakeholders. I'm sure you heard complaints about what else needs to be done. Can you tell us a little bit of like what you believe are the next steps in terms of policy frameworks for Brazil's transition to a net zero?
I think international diplomacy is one of the critical opportunities that we have, and that's why an event like this is so important. In the previous panel, we discussed a lot about SAF. It was a very important technical discussion, but then how we translate that into concrete opportunities is one of the things that we really need to put effort and time to make become a reality. So take the example of the previous discussion. SAF is one, individually in Brazil, is one of the opportunities that can create up to SAF alone is between 20 and $40 billion per year in the Brazilian economy. But for that to happen, biomass needs to be part of the discussion. Today, we have this belief that we have a limitation to produce SAF based on biomass. That's not true. We do have a challenge in terms of economically feasibility. But then if you go into the details, we have today 7 technological routes that for SAF that have very high potential. We discussed a few of them now. Caio mentioned, for example, Macaúba. Together with Macaúba, we also have palm. But what happened with palm? Palm, today we have a veto for production because of the model of palm produced in Indonesia that was based on monoculture and fostering deforestation. The model that we are discussing today, piloting in Brazil, actually is a model based on agroforestry. And this model could be combined with cocoa, and cocoa is a very good moment in the world because of the very high prices. But you only make it happen if you combine them. And today, like I'm part of a project that's piloting a model, a high-scale model for SAF based on biomass. And the high scale that we will get is 100,000 hectares in 5 years from now, because it takes time for this to be produced. But if we want to be relevant in the global demand for SAF, we are saying that we should be developing a pilot to cover 1 million hectares. Why we are far from that? Because we don't have the demand secured because of these discussions on the virus. So we need to be able to differentiate the palm based on agroforestry from the palm based on monoculture. And we are not advanced that in the global community yet. Once we do that, we guarantee we secure the opportunity to take the pilot to a whole new scale. And just to put a few numbers on the table, only on SAF, from 2030 onwards, we are talking about a market that's going to go up to 40 billion liters. But then in 2040, we are talking about 500 billion liters. So how are we going to change from the demand on 2030 to 2040 in time if we don't start planning it now? So this is an example of one of the technological routes that was discussed here. It's the same for Macaúba, it's the same for SAF based on oil, it's the same for all the other technological routes. But in the 7 main ones, 4 of them are not fully regulated yet in the world because they will be of high potential in regions like what we have in Brazil. But for that to happen, we really need to have a serious technical discussion, right? And it's a chicken and egg. If you don't have the demand, we don't have the supply. So saying that we don't have enough supply today, it's really like a misunderstanding based on the existing size of the areas that we have today, growing these kinds of biomass that could be used at a much higher scale.
Thanks, Patricia. You raised a point that appeared a few times today, which is, the specificities of Brazilian technological routes and how they should be recognized and related to the global discussions. This is more a question for the Brazilians here. Do you think Brazilians should occupy this space globally, like more actively, and have these technical discussions, show, okay, palm is done, like can be done in SAF in Brazil, and this and this and this are the upsides. This is different from the Indonesian palm experience. How can we occupy this space more proactively?
First, we wish a lot of carbon traveling inside of Brazil, because this last month I spent 2/3 of the month traveling, and most of it inside of Brazil. Like I talked about the other technological routes. So one is corn-based, sugarcane-based, SAF, ethanol, and then SAF and second, third generation of ethanol. The main productions are in Mato Grosso and São Paulo. For Macaúba and palm is in Pará, and Rondônia and Roraima have a very high potential too. So first we need to, Bahia is for Macaúba, but it's still at a smaller scale. We need to grow the production of Macaúba significantly, because today we are not using for that. And we are also testing the use of palm and Macaúba for cosmetics. Today is mainly palm, but if we manage to make it work for Macaúba, we'll again access a much bigger market. But for that, we need to go and get to see and talk to the local producers, understand the challenge that we have and the size of the opportunity. I've been learning a lot. The only certainty that I have today is that I know nothing about this, because the more I go and talk to people, the more I learn, and the more I see that our original data was wrong. Because now, in the last 2 years, many of the efficiency indicators that we had from 2 years ago, they are completely different. We learned a lot with all the pilots that we are conducting now. So we need to go to the field, talk, update the data that we have. Second, estimate the new scale based on the global demand. And this is the approach that the Ecological Transformation Plan is taking, that I believe is very important to us. Rather than taking the history as a reference, what they are doing is understanding the global demand. And in the Ecological Transformation Plan, we showed that if we tackle the demand in the energy transition and in bioeconomy, together with a few other pockets of opportunities, Brazil can actually double the GDP growth. So we are saying that we could grow above 5% per year, add more than $400 billion in our economy every year. But for that to happen, we also need to bring part of the global production of value-added goods to Brazil with clean energy in Brazil. So instead of exporting the biomass to the US, let's take as an example what happened with Bernardo Gradin, that I admire a lot, from Granbio. He got a very big grant to move his production of SAF to the US. He is one of the main experts in second, third generation ethanol, but the production is going to happen in the US now because of the incentives of the Inflation Reduction Act. So we need these value-added goods and the jobs to stay in Brazil. But for that to happen, the international diplomacy needs to be way more active, both on the government and on the private side.
Thanks, Patricia. You mentioned already that if all goes right, what can be the impact on Brazil's GDP. Now looking to French and European investors, what is your call for action for them to be part of it? Because if we're creating GDP, we are creating economic opportunities. What is your call for action to come and invest in Brazil?
So I think we have a unique opportunity. Brazil and France have a very long history of agreements that were very successful. Now we need to go back to the drawing board and design a few programs between governments, public sector, but also with private sector. We have new investment mechanisms that didn't exist before. I will highlight one. Like, as we heard the local community in Brazil, we also heard the international community. And de-risking the investments in Brazil was one of the critical asks from the investors. Today, the government in Brazil launched Eco Invest, which is a program for hedging of international investments that any of you can access immediately. And it's a very flexible model that is being done between the IDB and BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank. This is an important mechanism for investments and protect investors from exchange rates and also the country risk. So immediately available, and what is needed now is really investors going presenting their projects to scale up all these opportunities that were mentioned here. Just to highlight again, we talked a lot about energy transition, SAF, green hydrogen, biofuels are the main opportunities there. We talked about bioeconomy, nature-based solutions, models like the one that Regreen has on biodiversity credits and carbon credits are also big opportunities. Biotechnology, superfoods are amongst other opportunities like production of cocoa, acai, Brazil nuts, and the combination of that in bioeconomy and biohealth. Remembering that a country like South Korea now has just launched the major development program in South Korea now is biohealth. And Brazil can be a major player on that, and this is a partnership that France and Brazil could actually implement right now. So, and then to close it, all the decarbonization of the global economy, remembering that 75% of the global emissions come from industry and energy, we could be transferring part of this production with critical minerals in Brazil. I'll finish one very concrete example. Instead of talking about keep exporting cars to Brazil while we are not producing batteries that will be needed for the global energy transition in Brazil with clean energy in Brazil. Why is this important? We not only accelerate the transition, but we also work and contribute to reestablish the multilateralism, that today we are going towards the opposite direction. If all the countries focus in keeping the production side for energy, food security, we will end up slowing down the decarbonization of the economy instead of really accelerating it. So huge opportunity to everyone. And I hope we take the opportunity that we have now with so many people that are so knowledgeable in their specific sectors for us to go back home with concrete projects. And hopefully next year, Jorge, we will be here sharing examples of this successful exchange between Brazil and France. And thanks again for the opportunity and for taking also the leadership here to make us connect and make sure that we really go back home with this commitment to be more connected and to also not only through WhatsApp and emails, but also through concrete projects.
Thank you very much, Patricia.